Hello and welcome to the fourth installment of Get Used to It, which is a monthly show on these cable channels that deal with issues of importance to the gay and lesbian community. I'm Sheila Kuehl, and for the fourth time in a row, I'm your lucky host. And I am actually lucky today because we have a very interesting and I think intriguing show for you. Our topic today is racism in the gay and lesbian community. And I'm very privileged to have three distinguished guests that I'd like to introduce to you. First, directly to my left, though who knows how many of these people are actually to my left, we'll see, won't we, is Teresa Mendoza, who's from the steering committee of Lesbianas Unidas. Welcome, Teresa, thank you. Next to her, Phill Wilson, who is the founder of the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. And for those of you who are watching this show before February 11th and you'd like to attend the Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Conference, we'll tell you in the course of this show how to make contact so that you can do it, and I highly recommend it. My third guest, Parish, who is project coordinator for the Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team and is also a member of Colors United Action Coalition. Welcome, all three. Thank you very much for joining us today, or tonight, depending on when you're watching this show. I guess just to get us started, I'd like to kind of throw out a general question. We've had, as the viewers always know, some discussions before this with each other. But I wonder if you would kind of lay out as a kind of groundwork for all of us in the viewing audience, sort of, how does this problem manifest itself in our community that thinks that we're somehow better about these issues than other people because we get oppression or whatever, and yet this is not the case?
Well, it manifests itself in different ways. Myself personally, I've had to deal with groups not being sensitive to my culture as far as family is concerned, my religion, coming out, or just not addressing certain issues that are important to me in my culture. I don't know for the other guest how it's manifested itself there, but as far as the community action is concerned, it seems that people of color always make the effort to go to gay, lesbian demonstrations, protests, meetings, clubs, organizations, and we as people of color don't seem to get the same support that I feel we give the gay and lesbian, the mainstream gay and lesbian movement.
Well, it's primarily a white community, at least in front of the cameras, or in terms of what people refer to as the leadership. We talk about the leadership of the gay and lesbian community, and the best we get is a sort of perhaps a notion of inclusion, but that's not really enough, is it, Phill?
I think that it absolutely is not enough. I think that in the final analysis, if in fact, the gay and lesbian movement is about liberating gay and lesbian people, and it is about, in fact, a progressive agenda, then it's absolutely imperative that every level of that community reflects the reality of the gay and lesbian community and the reality of what we know to be the American society. We recently elected a new president, who spoke to this community very specifically. He said he had a vision of America that includes us. And I wonder how many of our leaders have a vision of this community that includes us. At the same time, our new president has said that he's going to create a leadership for this country that looks like America. We're going to be going to that table and we're going to say, as gay and lesbian people, we want to sit at that table. And it is very, very important that the delegation that we take to that table can pass that test.
What do you think the barriers are to that in our community? Rick, many of us think we're like getting there or something.
I think there's been this idea that we all start out on the same level, and we haven't been addressing the diversity of our community at all. We've seen racism evolve in the lesbian and gay community. We've gone from requiring people of color to produce 3-picture IDs to get into a bar. That was at one time, and now we've seen it evolve into the systematic exclusion of people of color in the decision-making process. And I think that's the worst form of racism in our community. Our biggest challenge is to start addressing these problems, because before we can start demanding rights from other people, we need to get our own house in order. And I think this, you know, forums like this are very positive in
Well, one of the things I've noticed, and I think is it's something Teresa brought up when we were talking too, is sort of, let us say that we ever get to the point where most of us think this is a good idea. Let us say that well, the first thing we should talk about is, I think a lot of people in the community think that we're much further than we are. Isn't the first step that the community really sort of has to acknowledge that we have this problem?
For me, I'm
sorry.
sorry. I think acknowledgement and recognizing that you are racist, sexist, homophobic, whichever it may be, is the first step. Then evaluate it. I mean, it just doesn't stop at recognizing it. Evaluate it, ask yourself questions, whether or not you even want to get beyond it, and then take action.
Well,
Sincere action.
I think that the fundamental question for our community is what is racism, to us as a community? I think that you're absolutely right that many gay and lesbian people believe that our community is more progressive on the question of race, because they believe that when you talk about racism, you talk about burning people's homes, you talk about violent attacks, and certainly that is a part of racism. And if it is sufficient to just eliminate those activities and to say we've eliminated those activities in our community on the question of race, therefore we've eliminated the whole issue of racism, that's a mistake. That in fact is not enough. The elimination of racism really involves creating a society and a culture and a community that truly reflects the diversity of that society, that culture, that community, that truly celebrates and includes each and every one of us and understands that we have valuable contributions. To that extent, one of the biggest barriers that we have is that the history of our organizing, the history of our political movement is fundamentally rooted in fear and networking.
And secrecy.
And secrecy, exactly.
Right.
So consequently, in the early days, if you were part of the Mattachine Society, or any of the early, gay and lesbian organizations, you joined those organizations because you knew someone, you were in their personal circle. And the only reason you can get in was to be in their personal circle, because that's the only way they could trust you. That's the only way they could know that you were not the police, or not an infiltrator, or those types of things.
And who's in your personal circle?
Right, but people who look like you and think like you and act like you.
So it's a sort of a Rolodex community. I mean, we used to talk about the lesbian community as kind of a living room community. A lot of us didn't go to bars. We had, parties in the house or dinners or whatever. It was a very private community, and very much for the same reason. Those, there was just your friends. You were going to say something, Rick. We were talking about acknowledging, like a first step.
I think there's this overall assumption that if you're lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and you are aware of your own oppression, that automatically makes you aware of all people's oppression, and that's just not the case. I think we also have a tendency to, when we do organize, we base our organizations on this white male patriarchal system of organization, and then we wonder why we get into trouble when it starts to fall apart.
And yet, where the organization is based on a white male patriarchal system, because it's filled with white male patriarchal persons, then if you don't fit into that,
right,
and women and people of color and people with disabilities who are invisible in our community have sort of suffered the same fate, which is people one step up on the oppression ladder don't get it, don't learn it.
Right.
One of the things I think is a problem for white people of good, faith or well-meaning or whatever, is they feel criticized, right? And they're afraid that if they admit their own racism, I should say we, because I've taken 10 steps, but who knows how many hundreds are left. That if you admit it, somehow it's a great failure of yourself. This notion that you said, that we think we're better at thinking about oppression because we are oppressed.
And we want to be better. We don't want to have these flaws. And I think gays and lesbian people have a tendency to be overly critical of themselves, and we want to be the perfect minority, and we want to be accepted by the heterosexual community. Therefore, we can't let these isms out in the open.
Well, that's another good point. All I wanted to say was it's not that terrible to let in consciousness to oneself. That there's a hatred here, there's a problem here, there's a history here, because you get through it a lot easier than you thought, or start to go through it. And you know, it's just like when straight people are nice to us, and we go, oh, thank you, and they didn't do anything. You know, it's sort of like the least you can do as a privileged majority or whatever, a privileged person. The least you can do is so okay that I can't imagine why everybody wouldn't just try really hard, because you get a lot of credit for it.
Oh.
Well, I just think that there are 2 points associated with that. Now, one, this notion that somehow being oppressed gives you an insight around oppression that you can then use to understand why you should not oppress other people is a mystery to me, because in this country, there's no evidence to that. Now, this country was built on waves of immigrants. Now, and each wave was oppressed by the wave of immigrants that came immediately prior to them. And they all turned around and oppressed the next wave of immigrants. You know, so it's a mystery to me that somehow we think that understanding oppression somehow impacts, you know, the way we treat, you know, other people. And it doesn't.
Well, but it's interesting sometimes if you adopt the point of view of oppressed people. I mean, there was no more downwardly mobile group than white dyke separatists 20 years ago. And they were the ones who insisted that there had to be signers or interpreters, you know, that there had to be ramps, that whatever. Talked a lot about racism, but I think part of the problem is we tend to throw all the oppressions together. We have this litany. We must fight against racism, sexism, homophobia, racism, sexism, ableism, if we even begin to include that, right? That's not enough to simply do that, because there are differences. And I think that one of the things that you said, Rick, about the answer seems to be, hi, I'm here in my white house, you come into my house.
Yes. There's always the tendency to have the oppressed person, whether it's based on sexism or racism, for the oppressed person to have to educate and have to explain why they should be accepted.
It becomes our responsibility.
Exactly, and why we can't assimilate. And there's also this idea that there's not enough room for a multitude of ideas and ways of expressing yourself and being yourself. We run our systems on this white male patriarchal established idea of reality, and there's no room for any other ideas in that.
Well, there's 2 other things too. Something Teresa said, which is that there's this anger at people of color for even bringing it up.
Which I wanted to touch on a point that you had made as far as white people or people in general. I mean, racism is not only, I mean, white people aren't the only people that are racist. Depends on what country you're in. But one point for me is that acknowledging that you're racism, that acknowledgement brings on the questions that there has to be change, and I think change scares people in addressing these issues, and also creating this smog over the gay and lesbian movement, that if we deal with racism, sexism, and homophobia within our own community, our movement is going to backstep. But you know, when we're there, if we ever get there, the movement itself, we're still going to have to deal with racism and sexism, homophobia. It has to be a very holistic kind of approach to that.
Well, I guess we're afraid of looking bad too. It's something that you actually, all 3 of you said to me when we were talking on the phone, is that it's sort of like, well, don't bring that up, you guys, because you know what we've got is a really important movement going here, and if you bring that up, then no one will like us or something. They'll think we're infighting it. So the women's movement gets the same thing. They say, oh, you know, why are you all infighting? And yet, people of color don't cause racism by bringing it up as an issue.
And
I mean,
that's how we're made
completely
to
a backwards
feel.
way to look at it, of course.
The question is, you know, what's the movement about?
Right.
You know, is the movement about, you know, social change so that people live better lives? Or is it simply about social change so people are not beaten up because of who they sleep with? You know, I would hope that the movement is about social change, you know, so that people can live better lives, and that we're focusing on those people who are impacted because of sexual orientation. To that extent, have we accomplished anything, or have we accomplished enough if our successes are limited to the simple question of who you sleep with? Because if our successes are limited to that question, then we are not in fact liberating the women in our community, because they still have to deal with gender bias. So if we're concerned with those individuals, we must address the full plate of issues that address them. People of color are still impacted by the oppression based on race. And we're not liberating gay and lesbian people of color if we don't deal with those issues. So fundamentally, our movement, I think, has to be about the people and not about the issue.
Well, I think it brings up a question of connection. And as soon as we come back from this short break, I want to get into that issue. So don't go away. Join us back again in just a minute, and we'll keep going.
Who cares?
It's their fault.
So what? Some fags get beat up.
You're such a fag.
It's their own fault.
Deserve to die.
Beat us. Fag.
Beat up.
Welcome back to Get Used to It. I'm Sheila Kuehl, your host. Today's topic is racism in the gay and lesbian community. My guests are Teresa Mendoza, Phill Wilson, and Rick Parish. We were talking just a minute ago about difference, really, I think, sort of to pull the thread together, and how the society makes differences that wouldn't ordinarily make a difference count for something. Color, gender, sexual orientation. If you were a Martian anthropologist, you would say, who cares? I mean, it could be left-handed, right-handed, and of course it would be, I suppose, if we were completely alike, except some people had longer feet, they would either be worse or better. We create hierarchy out of it. And the notion of how we think people will get racism because they get homophobia, and how we're finding that that's just not the case at all.
But actually, one of the things that you just mentioned is really, really important to this question of getting racism. So many people in our community really don't get homophobia.
It's a good point, Phil.
I mean, we don't get that. We don't understand how dangerous that is to us. We believe that there's ways that we can avoid it and protect ourselves from it and those types of things, and that's not true. And so that's an additional barrier.
Yeah, we think we do something to cause hatred.
Right.
And if it's sort of like being a battered woman, if I could just figure out what to do, it would stop.
And since fundamentally I deserve, or I believe that I deserve to be beaten up as a gay man, then it's okay to beat up on people of color because they're people of color, beat up on women because they're women. That's the cross that they have to bear. And until there is kind of a critical mass of folks in our community that really understand, that homophobia is not okay, that's going to always be a barrier in how we deal with the other levels of oppression.
Well, and racism's very much in the closet in our community. I mean, you were telling a story, which I hope you'll tell again, Rick, about the experience that you and your lover have had.
Yes, my former lover of 4 years and I were together, and he really had an eye-opening experience because I was the first man of color that he had ever dated. And as a result, he lost a lot of his friends. The phone stopped ringing. The invitations to parties stopped coming in the mail. And he was just blown away, and it caused a big problem for us. And it was a very, very painful situation. It was painful for me. It was very painful for him because on top of the pressure from his other friends saying, oh, why are you dating this colored man? Do you have a low self-esteem? Couldn't you do better than that or whatever? It was just a very ugly situation. And I was very, very disappointed by the fact that it was coming from what was supposed to be our community.
Well, I think a lot of times they say, oh, I can't believe that, and yet there's a lot of stories like that. I mean, that people feel free to say very racist things to their, to their white friends and encourage them not to participate. I think the other way we express it is by making differences invisible. It's sort of a two-edged sword, where we don't want differences to make a difference the way the majority wants it to, right? Just for no reason at all. But on the, so what the white population does is to say, okay, then I'll just treat us like we're all the same, which means all like me. But there are differences. Something you said very early on in the show, Teresa, reminded me, where we say it's really important to come out. But that has a different impact, I think, in different communities.
I'd like to address something you said as far as differences. Going back to what I said is that they're seen as obstacles as opposed to those bridges we talked about. Differences are okay, and they're okay to address them. And it's okay to not be okay with addressing them, just as long as they're out in the open and we're not invisible, and we're not made to feel like, as women, we're made to feel a lot of times that it's all in our heads. That's where a lot of my anger comes from, is that invisibility and that feeling like I don't have anyone that really mirrors me in my community. So I start from ground one, and I want to become that person for other people like me, other young Latina lesbians or whoever they may be. Because one turning point for me when I came out was meeting an Asian American lesbian. And I said, well, you know, if there's Asian American lesbians, there must be Latina lesbians. That was really a big turning point. I would not deal with being a lesbian, or I didn't deal with being a lesbian until I met someone of color. So that mirror, that someone that looks like you, is very important.
Is that because there's different issues?
Yeah, and it's also, for me, it was who I was comfortable with. I felt that if I was going to be part of this gay and lesbian community, that I had to leave my culture at home and basically assimilate. And I did for a while. I played, you know, their games, but it wasn't me. I was never comfortable, and I would cling to the people of color. As soon as a woman of color would come in, I talked to them because that was home to me.
Well, you know, on the question of making the differences invisible, you know, the sad thing about that is that that's just another way of oppressing people, you know. And I've heard people say, you know, well, I don't see color, I just see people as people. Now, and I actually find that offensive because that's a barrier against getting to know me, getting to know my history, getting to know how to relate to me as an individual. The other thing that it says to me is that the only way you can deal with me is to deny who I am, you know. And so the point is not for us to be the same. That's not in our best interest. That's not in our best interest as people of color or as a larger community. The point is to celebrate who we are as we are. Now, that really sounds very much like what we always say in a gay and lesbian context. You know, we want to just be celebrated for who we are as we are. And the reality is true inside our communities relative to race and gender.
I'm sorry, that's a really important point, because I think that once we begin acknowledging and respecting and really celebrating our diversity in our community, we're going to be that much stronger. You know, and I think that the new administration is recognizing that, because the lesbian gay community is really a microcosm of the world at large, of America. We are the face of America, and we need to realize that and celebrate that.
But you know, there's a political part to this too. The phrase that you used about going beyond cultural sensitivity to cultural competence.
Exactly.
Which is, I think, more than celebration. I can celebrate you, but I cannot get you, or see that the reality of your life may be very different. Well, and it's culture, it's country, it's family, it's race, you know, it's politic, it's everything, but it's bigger than just your color.
And that's been part of the problem. Cultural sensitivity is condescending, it's problematic, and it's ineffective. What we really need to move toward is cultural competency, is really knowing the cultures that you're dealing with, respecting the differences, and bringing those differences into the arena, because I think, again, we will be that much stronger.
Well, it's who you are. It's who you are to us, too, in a sense. It's something that all of you have said. You know, when a person of color in our community comes into a room, they're a person of color. You see the color first. White people really do, and maybe people of color too. It's the thing. It's omnipresent. And yet, we don't treat people of color as though they have full lives. Something you said during the break, which I want you to share with the viewers, Phill, about sort of being a leader in the community?
Well, you know, one of the things that happens, and one of the ways that racism manifests itself in our community, is that the larger communities has a hard time understanding that people of color bring anything else to the table other than an understanding of our cultural and our racial heritage. You know, and to that extent, you know, for example, if we are looking for someone to provide leadership or someone to speak on an issue or someone to be a part of a conference, now it's very clear, you know, all of the generic topics, all the universal subjects, you know, the first people that come to mind tend to be white people, you know, and when you realize that, you know, this entire event, everyone here is white, then you say, well, we need to raise the issue of people of color. We need to raise the issue of cultural competency or cultural sensitivity. Let's go to that people of color list, you know, and call someone and have them come in and do a workshop on racism or culture, what have you. I know in my personal life, you know, I find often that people will call me to talk specifically about public policy in people of color communities. And the reality is that my job, and my job since I've been doing public policy work, has always been to talk about public policy in a global context. You know, and if I'm not capable of dealing with issues of public policy as they relate to white men, you know, or white lesbians or women or any of those areas, then I should not have my job. You know, and that's another way in which we segment people. That's another way that we demean people and make people appear or feel less than.
Right, because it's a pigeonhole, and I think that what we want to try to do is to find some kind of a balance or a combination that allows recognition that something you said, Teresa, to me about, if I say to you, hey, come out, you know, just come out. You said a friend of yours had told you, and if you lose your family, no big deal. I mean, it's a big deal, but you know, we'll be your family now. We, you know, the gay and lesbian community, we're a big family, come into our big family. And that doesn't cut it exactly, to talk to a Latina lesbian, for instance, and just say, hey, no big deal.
Or any lesbian for that matter. I mean, that's, to me, I took offense to it because they didn't, first of all, they were dealing with me and talking to me with these white patriarchal terms, which at that time meant absolutely nothing. I told them that I was willing to sacrifice my sexuality for my family. And it's white patriarchal, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. That's how they came about to me. True, it does have to do with the level of whatever level they're at school or in their intellectual process. It's just that they didn't take the time to ask me about my culture and why I was willing to sacrifice it. I was seen as less than, as less intellectual, as less capable of grasping these really hard concepts as white patriarchy. So it was tough. I had to battle with that, and I did come out sooner than I should have come out because of that. But I had support.
Well, I think it's a risk for everybody to come out.
Yeah,
it's a risk for everybody, but the risks are different. I mean, there's a qualitative and maybe even a quantitative difference. I'm not saying people of color are much more victims than everyone else, but I think there has to be a recognition. There may be a concern because of a strong connection to your church. And for a white person who has no connection to their church to say, just, you know, come on over to my side of the line, doesn't recognize.
We're also dealing with completely different concepts of reality. I'm half Filipino and half African American, and there's always been the struggle between the Eastern philosophy and the Western philosophy. The West tells you that being yourself, being who you are, that's good. You know, you have to be an individual. You know, the individual rights are the most fundamental, basic thing that we keep dear. We hold this idea dear to us. And in an Asian society, it's like self-sacrifice, family, community. So when the Westerner tells, say, an Asian gay person, come out, forget your family, that's not even within the realm of possibility, you know.
And you know, on this question of we're a big family, I think that if we're going to make that charge, we have to fulfill that promise. You know? And we've not yet fulfilled that promise. You know, and yet we want people to pay the price, you know, but there's no ticket to the movie.
Right.
Well, and the fallback position, too, is different for people who have somebody to catch them when they fall. I mean, we have not used the major term, classism, but we might as well have a sticker like President Clinton had up during his campaign. It's economics, stupid. I mean, we have major divisions in our community, not just along color lines, but much more, just like in the larger society. And I think that's another place where people don't get it, where the community leaders tend to think, well, they know everybody's not rich, but they really don't get poverty. And that's a big difference for us.
And that crosses cultural barriers. Everyone's affected by economy, no matter what color you are, I think.
But you know,
But the truth of the matter is that there is a relationship between race and class in this country, and that can't be denied. And so, and both the reality of class and the perception of class, you know, that the reality is that for many people of color, you know, the questions of rejecting your church and rejecting your family, which in some cases are the only areas of support,
economic support,
right. You know, it is a different challenge to come out and to reject those institutions than it is for white gay men who often have a reality around self-sufficiency, you know, and more often the perception, the expectation, you know, the acculturation that says in the bottom line, you know, I'm going to succeed because I'm white and male. You know, on the other side of that fence, when we're talking about Latino lesbians or we're talking about African American gay men who are acculturated to assume that if you survive, you're lucky, you know, and so to kick away the underpinning so that suggests that there's a possibility or probability that you will survive is a much more frightening prospect.
And you know,
it's about basically privileges.
Right.
I have heterosexual privilege because when people look at me, they assume I'm heterosexual. Along with that, I'm disadvantaged because I'm female, and when they find out my sexuality, there goes my last and final privilege, you know, my color or my sexuality privilege. So it's about what you have to lose, and being of color and being gay, lesbian, bisexual, we have more to lose in the community.
And there is no support, really, but I think it's also a lack of, it's a fundamental lack of being able to identify with. I mean, I think that I was at a presentation that the center did a couple of years ago, the 200th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. And there was a bunch of lawyers on the stage talking about, you know, the Constitution and how it didn't apply to us and how it should and whatever. And at the end of the presentation, there were mics in the audience. And one white gay man came up to the mic, first guy to speak, and said, you know, I can understand why, he was trying to be very thoughtful, I can understand why people might be prejudiced toward people of color or women, but why us? And I thought, we all stood there, I was the moderator, and it was sort of like, there were more than 2 beats looking at this guy. I didn't know what to say to him. And so finally, of course, I said, panel? I really didn't know. And yet, I think that's an attitude that you breathe in privilege as you grow up. And I also think, when you're talking about the demonstrations after the veto of AB 101, the outrage in the white male community, and guys that you meet on the plane on the way to Washington for their very first march. You know, I look around, I can't believe there's anybody left in the world that has never been on a march. In our community especially, and yet there are a large number.
Unfortunately, for a lot of those people out there in the street, that was their first time ever having to be confronted with any kind of discrimination. You know, there's this favorite saying of a lot of people that my sexuality is my own business. That's internal homophobia, you know. And then they go out and say straight looking, straight acting. That's an internal homophobia, and I think they still don't see the connections between homophobia, racism, and sexism, and all the isms. You know, how they are interconnected. There were a lot of people of color who stayed home that night. Gay and lesbian people of color who said, good, you know, finally, hopefully they get it. Unfortunately, a lot of them didn't get it, because then we had the Rodney King verdict, and these same people who were out there in the streets We're sitting in the bars watching the few queers of color out in the middle of Santa Monica Boulevard trying to muster up some kind of support, and there we were.
Well, that's the other thing, too, is the demands made. Did I interrupt you?
Well, I was just going to say the answer to the guy in the audience was, no, why not? You know, which is the point that Rick was making. One of the points, you know, in Rick's analysis around AB 101, that certainly there were some people who stayed home because they felt good. But I think the majority of people of color who did not participate in the response to AB 101, they did not participate because they were not surprised. You know, it was a continuation of the status quo. It was not a confrontation. You know, it was not new news. You know, for many white gay men, AB 101 was a wake-up call because it was the first time for many of them that they realized, you know, there are people in this country, in this state, who don't believe I count or who believe that I don't count. You know, and yet, you know, when someone says that to me, and for many people of color, we're not surprised that there are people who believe that we don't count.
Well, we've grown up knowing that we have things to be ashamed of, whether it's our color, our gender. We're ashamed of those things, but we are not able to hide them. I mean, we are, you know, we are who we are, and we look that way. But being gay or lesbian is really different. As soon as we come back from this break, I want to continue to talk about maybe the relationship between these isms and how we can help people work through to some extent, without doing too much educating here on the show, to get someplace with it. We'll be right back.
At first, we didn't know what to think.
He said he was gay.
We thought we had done something.
I was so angry, so hurt.
We didn't know where to turn.
Talking to other families at Parents' Flag was a lifesaver.
Now we're closer than ever.
She's the same daughter she always was.
We love him just as much as always.
Parents' Flag helped us through it.
You are not alone. Talk to us. We understand. For the Parents Helpline nearest you, call 1-800-4FAMILY.
Hi, welcome back to Get Used to It. Our topic today is racism in the gay and lesbian community. We were talking about differences a lot and about how we can kind of deal with them and about how the white community doesn't get this at all. But there are connections, don't you think, between racism, sexism, homophobia, and although you're, I think, really correct, Phill, that there are a lot of gay people who don't get homophobia, don't understand why they hate us, or are so ashamed, don't want to talk about it, which is the other thing you were talking about, Teresa. But there are connections, don't you think? Similarities?
Well, I think that it's not just the white community doesn't get those issues. I mean, people in general don't get those issues. You know, now I've been working on progressive issues for a long time, and it's funny that some of the thoughts haven't changed. You know, in 1985, I met Bayard Rustin, and one of the things that he said to me and to a bunch of us who were talking to him at the time, and I find it shocking that the words are so appropriate today. Now, he talked about oppression as a whole cloth, and other people have heard me use that analogy that I stole from him. But that's the connection, that oppression is a whole cloth, you know, and that, you know, the isms are connected. And some of us believe that we can look at this cloth and we can cut out the part that offends us. You know, I'm a woman, so I'll cut out sexism, and then I'll create a fabulous dress out of the rest of the cloth. You know, or I'm a gay man, and I'll cut out homophobia. You know, and I can create a garment out of the rest of the cloth. And the truth of the matter is that the threads are woven throughout the cloth. You know, and that to embrace any of the cloth, to use the cloth for any purpose, is to embrace all of the cloth. You know, and so that you cannot fight homophobia without fighting racism and sexism, and you cannot fight sexism without fighting the other forms of oppression, because they're all connected.
I think it's important, too, that people, a lot of times white women are beginning to get the fact that we are oppressed and privileged. And therefore, if we can take whatever we can learn from our own oppression and apply it without fear to kind of understanding what other people are saying. I mean, every one of us here is privileged also in some way. Maybe whether it's economic, the two of you being men instead of women, we were talking about immigrant women, for instance, and the dangers or risks to them about coming out, or let's say undocumented immigrant women. each of us has a sort of, we're a level up from somebody. And so I think that that goes with understanding the whole cloth, and maybe will help people who watch the show who are trying to say, well, you know, I don't get it, to understand, because they're exactly the same thing. They are being the victim of someone's unreasonable hatred based on an artificial difference.
And you know, it's funny that you say that, you know, given what's going on currently in the media around, you know, gays and lesbians in the military.
Yeah.
You know, and if as a community we don't understand the link between racism and homophobia as it manifests itself on the military question, you know, then maybe it's appropriate to lose all hope, you know, because the issues that the Pentagon are raising around gays and lesbians in the military, you know, in some cases are direct quotes from the issues that the military raised around integrating, you know, the military. You know, the issues around morale, you know, the issues, you know, around spirit, you know, and all these specious arguments. You know, and fundamentally, as a country and as a people and as a community, you know, we have to say either discrimination is wrong or it's okay. Now, if it's wrong, then we are challenged to fight it forcefully wherever we confront it. If it is okay anywhere, then we weaken, if not totally eliminate, any argument we may have to suggest that people should not discriminate against us.
I also don't think that people realize how joyful it is to participate in liberation movements, and especially when they join. I mean, I think those guys that went out on the street for AB 101 were having a wonderful time, because suddenly there's a joyfulness in this fight. It just feels great to finally assert yourself and say, this is who I am, get used to it, you know? And yet I don't think they yet understand how joyful it is to also participate with people who are in their own liberation movements, and yet the connections are so clear that it's fun, you know, it's important. Everybody should go to the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Conference, not only because, well, we should go there because, you know, it's a good thing to do. It's incredibly interesting, much, not really a different reality so much as a broadening of what we already understand. The same with any conferences or whatever.
Well, you know, the conference is empowering, but beyond that, you know, I have not ever been to any meeting where people really, in any sort of intellectual or historical way, talked about gay and lesbian liberation without referring to the Black Civil Rights Movement or the women's movement. And certainly, the words of those leaders are very powerful, but we have the privilege of having access to people within our community who are thinking about those issues, experiencing those realities every day. You know, we can talk to these people. We don't have to read about, you know, the things that other very great leaders said. You know, we can meet people of color in our communities who understand racism, who understand sexism, who understands the connection between the oppressions of people based on sexual orientation that we can learn from and celebrate with.
So but that distance is safe for white people, or just people who deal with life with these isms, are practicing isms. That distance is very safe. I know for myself, it was very safe to keep my distance from any kind of homosexual or any kind of idea or concept that challenged what I thought was who I am. And that distance is very safe, looking at it from a historical basis. And this happens all the time. Our issues for people of color are treated in a book sense, as theories, as ideas, as opposed to turning to us and saying, hey, you know, talk to us, and dealing with us as like people, as people,
or
as opposed to just theories.
Or even including us in the decision-making process.
Yeah.
I heard you say that before. What do you mean, Rick?
We have a tendency to create these systems and these organizations that systematically, whether they're aware of it or not, they systematically exclude people of color. Many times they exclude women. And the worst form of racism to me is not to burn a cross on my lawn. It is to exclude me and then start speaking for me.
So what do we see that's hopeful? mean, I've heard, actually, each of you has used the word hope in different ways. And
the word of the season.
It is the word of the season. You know, could this guy have been born in a more fortuitous town? Can you believe it? The man from Hope. It's like when he was born, his mother must have said, this one's going to look good on television.
Yeah.
You know, they actually, I think, had television when he was born. But seriously, I think that it feels hopeful to me.
There are people in our community that are white that are dealing with these issues, and I know it for a fact. So in that sense, it is hopeful. And on the other hand, it is hopeful to go to a conference or to turn on the TV and see some people of color. It's still not enough, but you know, that optimistic part of me thinks that it's leading somewhere. And I know that change takes time, but that doesn't pacify me in any way. But I know that it's a process, and I'm hoping that, you know, something will happen.
My hope is not rooted in what white people are or are not doing. My hope is rooted in what people of color are doing. You know, the work that we're doing to empower ourselves, to celebrate ourselves, the contributions we're making, you know, to this movement and to other movements. You know, one of the things that's most exciting for me about the National Black Gay and Lesbian Conference, for example, is that this is going to be our 6th annual conference. Now, when we began, no one thought that the first one would be a success. Now, and this year, we're expecting nearly 800 folks from all over the world. People are coming from Germany and from England and from France and from Brazil and all these places, you know, to be at this conference. Now, and that's a part of us deciding that we are going to be powerful in who we are. And to the extent that people want to actively or passively exclude us from their progressive agenda, you know, that's going to be their loss. You know, because we are a powerful voice, we are a powerful force, and we're going to use that force and that power.
But we gain something as a movement by being truly inclusive, by really listening, you know, by getting it, don't you think? I mean, if people care about the movement now, and I think a lot of people do, then it's important to see this as a benefit and not as a problem.
Right.
We don't want to sweep it under the rug because we don't want people to know we have divisions. We use the word celebrate. It's become a little bit of a buzzword. You know, it's hard to celebrate your difference because it's led to oppression. And I don't know, should I feel bad for you, good for you? I do feel good for you. I feel bad for you. You know what I mean? There's a lot of, it's very ambivalent. We don't have a through line on it.
Well, that's not, it's not necessary for you to feel for me.
Right.
I mean, that's part of that. You know, what's necessary is for you to feel for you. You know, you don't have to feel for me. I can feel for me. I can do that. You know, and part of dealing with racism is acknowledging that I can do that. You know, what you have to make sure is that you don't contribute to the barriers, you know, of me being fulfilled. You know, and that's the challenge for our community.
Exactly. And I think what Phill said about what people of color do for themselves is extremely important. Many Asian Pacific Islanders were concerned that the quote-unquote mainstream AIDS agencies were not able to outreach to a community as diverse as the Asian Pacific Islander community. You're dealing with 15 different ethnicities, 20 different languages, and they were just not being effective. So rather than sit and complain about it, we created the Asian Pacific AIDS Intervention Team. And not only, we're not a separatist group, we are building bridges, and we are developing relationships with the other agencies, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And also, as a result of this, we also have the first Asian Pacific Islander Women's Caucus that is specifically outreaching to Asian lesbians, bisexuals, and heterosexual women.
Well, I think people tend to pigeonhole the kind of work that someone can do in a way that says either you're working in the community or you're building bridges.
Right.
I mean, when I went to law school, people were very critical of me, of a lesbian going to law school, because that was going to somehow, you know, usurp my politic or whatever. And it was just the opposite. Law school, you know, the law is a toolbox, and I just wanted to get a few more tools. But I think that we play both these roles. I know all three of you do. It's not just building bridges and walking across them, which is there's got to be more than building bridges, but working in the community too. I mean, Phill, you're a great example of it because you've spent a lot of your life on empowerment of African American gay and lesbian people, and a lot of mentoring, a lot of role modeling, a lot of just roll up the sleeves and do it. but also no question that you've worked with other communities in the community, and I think both are possible and both are necessary. Maybe that's where the solution lies, is the question is, okay, you've got some privilege, what are you going to do with it, in essence?
You know, I guess I look for the day when, you know, particularly among white gay men, that when they find themselves in rooms where everybody else is white and male, you know, that they're uncomfortable about that, you know, that we don't have to walk into the room, you know, for there to be that discomfort. You know, I'm like amazed when I talk to white gay men who have an experience where they're the only white person in a black environment or a Latino environment, you know, or Asian environment, and how uncomfortable they are, you know. And, you know, I don't have a lot of sympathy for that, you know, and because I experience that on a regular basis, you know, and so it's not such a shock to me. But I would want those individuals to have that discomfort, you know, when they're in a room where everyone is white, you know, that those are the individuals that need to say, this is not okay, I don't like this, this is not fun for me, you know, this is not what our movement is about, this is not helpful, you know, that I want my life, I want my movement, I want my politics, you know, to reflect the diversity of this community, because that's going to assure that I am able to overcome, you know, the discrimination that happens against me. That's the only way that I'm going to be able to overcome my own oppression.
Right, see the identity of the issues. Well, I think, and it's good work. That's why I want to emphasize the fact that people don't have to feel like it's depressing if they're cognizant of some of these flaws in the community. It's only going to strengthen our community. I mean, it seems to me that LA's changed a lot. I grew up in LA. I grew up by the Coliseum, and it was all white neighborhood, and then not, and then so, you know, and then we moved to the Crenshaw district, and that's where everybody still is in my family. And it changes so subtly that now I flew from LA to Salt Lake City in order to change planes and go to this conference in South Dakota. And on the plane, when I got on in LA, it was a regular sort of LA crowd. Now it's affluent because they're on a plane, but still it's racially mixed, and it's not just black, brown, yellow, and white. It's lots of every kind of, you know, shades and colors. That feels normal to me. I get off the plane, I get on the plane in Salt Lake City, there's nothing but white people with, you know, thick necks, seriously, going to South Dakota. And I felt uncomfortable because it felt unfamiliar. And I think that's what our community has to work harder to do, is to make a room of only one, you know, only white people or only men, an uncomfortable room for the people in it. I want to ask you something. During the revolution, a long time ago, I remember the African American community saying, we're taking care of family business, which is part of what I heard you say. We do our own empowerment. We need to work on this. You take care of your family business, they said to me, which meant do your racism work in your white community, and don't ask us to come and educate you about it. You know enough about it now to work on it. If we do that without being ashamed, you know, it's like we don't want to feel that we're racist because it makes us feel ashamed and then we have to do something about it. If we simply do it, can we do it without asking people of color for something? I don't know exactly. I hear you say, don't put the burden on me. It's not my job to educate you. Everybody's saying, what is it you people want? Yet there's some realities that we don't have access to without that contact. What's the balance?
I'll give you an example. I, as a man, was raised to be sexist. That's the harsh, cold reality of it. In order for me to get over my sexism, I've had to take a proactive role in my own life to find out, why am I sexist? What are the things that I'm doing, things that I'm not even aware of? You know, I've had to take that responsibility. Now, if people decide to start owning their isms, that's when we're going to start seeing change.
I think that certainly, you know, the battle to end racism, you know, is going to take lots of energy and lots of talent and lots of folks, you know, to ultimately do that. But I think that this thing about you take care of your family, I'll take care of my family, and really boils down to understanding and respecting that people of color have a full plate, you know, and to understand that for many of us, when I work on racism in a white context, that's a diversion from things that are very, very important to my life. You know, and given the limited human resources that I have, you know, that's a sacrifice for me. You know, and so understand that and value that. You know, and so that the things that you can do on your own, that you do them on your own, and that in fact you don't ask us to come to you to help you deal with your problem, that you find ways to integrate yourself into our communities, you know, find out who we are, you know, so that you learn the lessons that you need to learn from an organic place, from a natural place. This is actually artificial when I come to your house and tell you what's going on at my house.
Well, unfortunately, they're giving me this wrap-up signal, which means even though we can't believe it, this whole hour's gone by.
Has it really?
Yeah, and so many things to say, and I
need to pitch my number if people want to come to the Black Gay and Lesbian Conference.
I want you to do that right now.
Well, if anyone's interested in attending the National Black Gay and Lesbian Conference, they can call 666-5495. The conference is at the Long Beach Hilton, and it runs from February 11th to February 15th, and everyone's welcome, and it's going to be a great time.
And if you miss this one, you better go next year or I'll never speak to you again. Get used to it. We hope you'll tune in and watch us every month. This is your show, and incidentally, because it's your show, we'd like you to call in if you have anything to say to us. We're at area code 310-967-7240. Let us know. If you have any mean comments, though, don't call. Okay. Oh, well, you can if you want. We'll see you next time.